So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current situation that we have in Britain in relation to the police and prison system. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it is I think we got here, maybe thinking through questions of capitalism as well, given the name of the organisation that's organised today's event. And then I'm going to think a little bit about how we can resist and how people are currently resisting the police and prison state. So currently in Britain, over the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen an unprecedented rise and expansion in prison and police power. The police have more powers than they've ever had before. Some of the new powers that they have include the power of injunctions. They were first introduced by Tony Blair with his very famous ASBOs, where young people who are considered to be nuisances, mainly in working class, often racialized communities in this country, could have antisocial behavioral orders imposed upon them, which would prevent them from going to certain places, speaking to certain people and what have you. And he also introduced them with the now infamous Terrorism Act, where control orders could prevent people who hadn't been found guilty of a crime or suspected of an offence from going to certain places, speaking to certain people, and in some cases effectively being under house arrest. Today we see this being expanded with injunctions imposed upon so-called people suspected of being involved in so-called gangs, people suspected of being involved in so-called knife crime, and a whole host of other what we might call moral panics, which I'm going to talk about a little bit as well. We've also seen a huge expansion in police surveillance, whether it be surveilling our digital communications, our mobile phone usage, our internet usage, or surveilling us through their imposition in the healthcare sector by working with medical professionals looking for people who might display signs of so-called gang activity or violent extremism, by being imposed in schools, where we're seeing more and more police officers being stationed in schools, particularly in working class and communities of colour. But we're also seeing, and I think this is really crucial, the unprecedented expansion of Britain's prison population. Since the early 1990s, the prison population in Britain has almost doubled, and the women's prison population has more than doubled. And one of the main reasons for this, in addition to the expansion of police power I've already mentioned, is also the criminalisation of drugs, particularly for the expansion in the women's prison population. Over half of Britain's women's prison the incarcerated women in Britain reports being incarcerated due to the criminalisation of their own drug use or the drug use of somebody in their care. So how did we get here? Has our prison population expanded this rapidly because Britain has become more immoral, more violent, more dangerous, more criminal? Or are there other political reasons why Britain's prison and police systems have expanded so rapidly over the last few decades? And for this, I'm going to maybe turn to a tiny little bit of theory. And I'm going to think through one of my favourite Marxian scholars, Stuart Hall. And what Stuart Hall says, who passed away a few years ago, if people aren't familiar with him, a really great black thinker of Marxism and cultural studies. And in the 1970s, when he noticed an expansion of police and prison power, what him and his colleagues said was that the police and prison system was being used to police away a crisis of capitalism. And so because, as I'm sure many of us are aware, capitalism is crisis-ridden, there are constantly crises of unemployment, of pensions, crises related to housing and social welfare, and obviously more recently a crisis in our healthcare system and a pandemic, an ecological crisis, and a looming crisis, climate catastrophe, the crisis that we see in our financial system. A whole host of different crises arise out of capitalism. And as we also, I'm sure, are fully aware, the governments that we have in countries like Britain, as well as the United States, are either unwilling or unable to effectively ameliorate these crises. So what do they do instead? How do they maintain legitimacy when it is so clear that the economic system that we're in is in crisis? What they do is they help to manufacture a different crisis. Right? So drawing people's attention away from the crisis of employment, of housing, of pensions, of the environment, of the healthcare system, of our social care system, and instead identify a law and order crisis, a crisis of criminality. And in the 1970s, when Stuart Hall was writing, that so-called law and order crisis was defined as a crisis of so-called mugging, which a term I'm sure everyone is familiar with. And I think what's crucial about mugging is that mugging isn't a crime in and of itself. It's a category of crime. Right? And what that means is that if you manufacture a new category of crime, you kind of vacuum up, you suck up lots of existing crimes. So for the case of mugging, it might be theft or assault or robbery or what have you, creating the impression that there is a new problem, that there is a different problem. And if there is a new and different problem, it can be attributed to a new and different people. And in the case of the mugger, it was young black men to which this purportedly new and different problem was attributed. Today, I think we can see comparable moral panics around criminality arising, of course, as this current government seeks to ameliorate the crisis that we're seeing in the continual fallout of the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008, of the healthcare crisis that we're seeing illuminated during the current pandemic, and of course, the related crisis of social care. The crisis that we're seeing with our environment and the looming climate crisis, and of course the crisis that people are living in our major cities relating to housing and employment. And it's through this crisis of law and order that we again see new moral panics arising. These are generally identified as, I guess, maybe 3 or 4 kind of racial folk devils, criminal folk devils that we need to respond to by expanding the police and prison system. And I would say that these are generally the immigrant, the gangster, the terrorist, and often as well the gypsy Roma traveller. And I would say that these 4 racialized folk devils create the impression that this is the real crisis that the people of Britain are facing. This is the real crisis that this government needs to ameliorate in order to re-cement its legitimacy, in order to affirm its worth in the eyes of the British electorate. But of course, as I'm sure everyone is aware, the expansion of police and prison power to deal with this purported crisis of law and order has done nothing to improve public safety, particularly within the most oppressed communities in British society. Despite the massive expansion in police and prison power, which, as we can see, specifically is justified or rationalized through the targeting of racialized minorities, we haven't seen the kinds of improvements in safety or harm reduction that are promised. And what we, of course, instead see are forms of racist policing, expansion of prisons that see around 25% of Britain's prisons being incarcerating, or the prison population having about 25% people of colour, despite the fact they only constitute about 13% of Britain's general population, and Britain now incarcerating black people at the same rate as the United States incarcerates African Americans. And maybe we can talk about the histories of British colonial policing and British colonial penal policies and penal justice systems to better understand the historical context in which Britain's current prison and police system continues to reproduce an institutionalized racism. So how are people resisting? So in comparable ways to which we're seeing in the United States, which Nancy outlined so coherently, we're seeing a whole host of social movements seeking to build community-led alternatives to the police and prison system. Some of the most explicit and perhaps best known, of course, associated with the social movements that emerged out of the summer of last year, principally various iterations of Black Lives Matter, but also a whole host of youth-led movements as well, including Forefront projects and the Forefront projects in the north of London, No More Exclusions, which is a national project, a project called Knowledge is Power, and Hackney Account, both based in the East End of London, as well as a whole host of other projects in Manchester, including Northern Police Monitoring Projects and Kids of Colour. And these are just some of the youth-led organisations which are seeking to develop community-led solutions to serious youth violence that does exist within working class communities, but cannot be effectively dealt with by the expansion of police and prison power. We're also seeing radical feminist movements, particularly those supporting survivors of domestic violence, including groups like Sister Space in the East End of London, but also more national activist movements like Sisters Uncut, which are working with a whole host of different organisations to address violence against women and other forms of gender-based violence, whilst at the same time developing alternatives to the prison and police system. We're also seeing a whole host of a massive expansion in community-led coalitions against prison and police expansion, which include these feminist organisations and these black-led anti-racist organisations, but are also incorporating trade union and renters union organisations, also including radical community-led mental health provision, also including radical community-led supports for people who use drugs problematically. A whole host of organisations which perhaps very often, perhaps in previous generations, would have considered themselves to not be directly linked to or on the periphery of anti-police and anti-prison organising. But I think the crucial thing about abolitionism is that it's not simply a movement which seeks to dismantle. It's not simply a movement which seeks to destroy a system of domination. Crucially for abolitionists, it is a system of building alternatives. And so therefore working both with the kinds of organisations that you might more easily identify with being in direct confrontation with the state, like the protest movements that we associate with Black Lives Matter, like the feminist mobilizations like Sisters Uncut, but also the community building institutions like our youth services, our community-led mental health provision, our trade and renters unions. All of these kinds of structures are fundamental for us to be able to build the kinds of community safety which don't rely on police and prison power. And I think it's the combination of this direct confrontation with state violence, as well as the community-led alternatives to those systems of state coercion, that I think makes the movement for abolition both compelling and urgent, as well as holding the same kind of revolutionary potential that we might associate with earlier iterations of revolutionary power in previous decades as well. And maybe I'll leave it there.